I'm recording this on the 22nd of January 2010 and providing some thoughts on what was achieved in Copenhagen, what was not achieved in Copenhagen, and how it will affect the UNFCCC process in particular beyond Copenhagen. Let me start with the Copenhagen Accord that was agreed by a number of leaders in Copenhagen, but was then subsequently at the final hours of the Conference of Parties on Saturday morning, was not adopted by the COP, by the Conference of Parties, but in fact noted. Now this has caused a lot of confusion. What is the difference between adopting and noting? I'm not quite sure we've all worked it out yet. Everybody's trying to work out what it means, but some things are beginning to be clear. Firstly, the accord itself has a time limit of 31st of January for countries to sign up to it and provide information on their mitigation targets and activities. So we will find out on the 31st of January how many countries actually sign up to it. But it's quite clear that by not adopting it, and at the final plenary session there were a number of countries initially led by Tuvalu, but then also joined by Sudan and a number of Latin American countries like Bolivia, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on, that objected very strongly to the accord being adopted as a Conference of Parties document. And hence the final compromise in the final hours was that it was noted but not adopted. On the other hand, the COP did make a decision, which was that the two tracks that had been negotiated based on the Bali Action Plan coming out of COP13 2 years ago, which was supposed to have ended in COP15 in Copenhagen, obviously could not be completed, but they were mandated to continue for another year. So the LCA and the Kyoto Protocol tracks, the two tracks of the negotiations that came out of the Bali Action Plan, continue to be negotiated towards COP16, which will be held in December 2010 in Mexico. Now, there were no additional sessions or extra sessions of the UNFCCC agreed in Copenhagen, so we will have our regular subsidiary bodies meeting in June in Bonn, which may be elevated to a ministerial level because of the importance of the issue, and there might still be other additional sessions agreed as well between now and Mexico to finalize the two tracks of the negotiations. But the negotiations remain alive. Now the question before us is what happens in the negotiation process and what happens in the accord process, which is now a de facto parallel process. In my view, the fact that the COP noted but did not adopt means that even though the accord was agreed by a number, there's supposed to have been 25 leaders in the room when they sat and agreed it, it is actually a non-UNFCCC agreement. And it is similar to other such non-UNFCCC agreements that have been taking place over the last few years, one of them being the Major Economies Forum that meets and has declarations, another one being the G8 plus the G15 meetings where they have also had similar sorts of declarations. These are all parallel processes which the UNFCCC generally notes but does not adopt. What is adopted in the UNFCCC is finally what is agreed. And it's very important to make that distinction because the UNFCCC process with 192 countries is the only legitimate global process to tackle the global problem of climate change, which all countries have signed up to and agreed should be done. And therefore, this question of legitimacy of agreements is a paramount issue. No other process with a subset of actors, no matter how important those actors are, can be as legitimate as the UNFCCC. The second important part of the UNFCCC process is that it is a treaty. It's a global treaty. When countries sign up to it, they are supposed to abide by it. Not only that, in the Kyoto Protocol, which is a protocol under the Framework Convention, we also have binding agreements for reducing emissions from the Annex I countries, and there are compliance mechanisms, and there are mechanisms for penalties for non-compliance. This is the closest, in my view, that we have been able to reach as a global community of having global governance in which all countries sign up to take actions, and if they don't take those actions, there are penalties involved. There's no other similar sort of global agreement that has that level of compliance and penalties. Even though they're not very strong penalties, nobody's going to go to war with a country if they fail to comply with their Kyoto target, but nevertheless they are as strong as it gets in the international regime. And therefore, a legally binding agreement in Mexico, which we failed to achieve in Copenhagen, is a very important part of the UNFCCC process, which the Copenhagen Accord failed to do. The Copenhagen Accord is a voluntary agreement. There are no penalties for non-compliance. It is simply not good enough. And I think even the people who signed up to the accord accept that it is not legally binding, and in that sense, it is deficient and not good enough. So hopefully in Mexico, we will be able to take another crack at coming up with a legally binding agreement under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has the legitimacy of all 192 countries signing up to it. Now, what do we need to achieve between now and Mexico to do that? I would say two things. Firstly, we need to look at the accord again, and there are elements in the accord that can be seen as positive. They have agreed a 2-degree limit. This was something that's new, what was not achieved before that. They have identified new funds, short-term funds of $30 billion over the next 3 years, and then longer-term funding at the level of $100 billion a year from 2020 onwards. These are both new and very positive developments. Some might say they're not enough, but at least they are a good start. And then there is also a very important provision in the last paragraph of the Copenhagen Accord that enables or promises to revisit the issue of 2 degrees and revisit the target of 1.5 degrees, which was pushed by some of the most vulnerable countries, particularly the Alliance of Small Island States and also the Africans and the least developed countries, although in the end they did not stick to the 1.5 degrees. But in the final accord, particularly at the insistence of President Nasheed of the Maldives, who was in the group of 25 countries, that 1.5 degrees was kept. And the way it was kept, that in 2016, after the 5th assessment report of the IPCC comes out, they will reassess whether we need to adjust the 2-degree limit to 1.5 degrees. So that is a very positive element in the accord that we can build on. So what we need to do is to look for these positive elements in the accord and bring them into the UNFCCC process so that they can become part of a legally binding agreement that all 192 countries can sign up to in Mexico. I think that is possible. There are two major obstacles to it. One of them relates to the position of the United States of America, which is the richest country in the world and until very recently was the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases that had not signed up to Kyoto. They need to be part of that legally binding agreement. In Copenhagen, under President Obama, they were not prepared to sign up to a legally binding international agreement because President Obama felt that without the backing of his Congress, he would not sign up. I think what he was afraid of was a repeat of what happened in Kyoto, where Vice President Al Gore at that time led the US delegation. It was under the Clinton administration. They signed up to Kyoto, in Kyoto, but then they never got the ratification through their own Congress. And so the US, under President Bush, withdrew from Kyoto. I think Obama does not want to have that happen again. So he doesn't want to sign up to an international agreement first and then have difficulty getting it through Congress. He wants Congress to sign up first and then sign up to an international agreement based on their domestic legislation.